One often thinks, that great men or people of high intelligence should only be with partners that they utterly deserve or that are, remarkable in their turn. I think that's just, it ignores what love is about. I mean, love happens and it's irrational and you can't really explain it. In a certain sense, there's a mystery at the heart of the relationship between Bosie and Oscar. I think Bosie was incredibly handsome, very sexy as far as Oscar was concerned. He also, represented the ideal of gay beauty as it existed at that time, which derived almost entirely from the classics and from their, reading of the Greek, ancient Greek and Roman Latin texts. And, there was the sort of ideal of Narcissus and the beautiful golden youth. And in many ways, that's exactly how Bosie seemed to Oscar. But, that apart, it's still a mystery. He fell in love with him.
People are often puzzled by what it was that Oscar saw in Bosie, aside from his beauty. And you might say, well, beauty is enough. Beauty can easily be enough. But when you're talking about a man of such profound intelligence and insight, was Oscar Wilde so shallow as simply to fall for a pair of beautiful eyes and lovely lips and a beautiful body and shining hair? Was that all it was? And I don't think it can have been. One thing I think one has to believe absolutely is that Bosie loved Oscar and Oscar loved Bosie, each in their own way, and they did, and they needed each other. It's pretty clear that they stopped having sex very early on, and that in some ways Wilde was right when he said in court, he talked about, the love that dare not speak its name, and he was right that his relationship with Bosie was a rather Socratic, a Platonic one. He was a teacher. He saw this young, beautiful, sort of ideal form, as it were, and believed he could make something of him. He couldn't, of course, because Bosie was what we would now call I suppose, an abused child. Came from what we would call a dysfunctional family. His father would kick him away when he was very small. He was shown no affection. His parents were split, broken up, And on top of that, he came from an old aristocratic family with a lot of money, just as the aristocracy was sort of coming towards the end of its great domination of world affairs and British affairs. And he was that useless thing, a younger son, who never has a role to find. Traditionally, it's the church or the military. I don't think Bosie would have been suited for either of those. And as one of the characters in the film says, the empire was not built by men like Bosie Douglas. And Wilde was drawn to him, I think, also because he had this extraordinary quality of boldness, that for all his faults, he had a kind of courage, which was to do with his aristocracy, to do with the fact that he was accustomed to being shown deference and to being able to display eccentricity and difference in a way that the middle classes, who yearned for absolute acceptance and respectability, were not. And the aristocracy have always been able to be fluorescent and extraordinary in their manners and flamboyant in their behavior because they've got nothing to prove. They don't have to establish their status and their right to respect because it's given in title, at least so they imagine. Whereas the middle classes are always desperate to conform and are always much more absurdly puritanical than either the working or the upper classes. And I think Wilde was drawn to that because although he was an artist and a bohemian and in that sense strictly déclassé, as they would say, he was outside of class. Part of him was bourgeois, and Bosie knew that. Part of him was conventional, Oscar. Part of him wanted to be accepted by society. The other part, the Irish maverick part, wanted to be an outsider, a mocking commentator. But another part yearned for acceptance. And I understand that completely. I know just what that feels like. I mean, I'm much the same. I think a lot of people are. That while they mock and scorn bourgeois values and Puritanism and judgmental attitudes of bourgeois morality, a part of them deeply wants to belong. And I think that's central to their relationship.
I don't want to sit here. I want to sit there.
You heard what Lord Alfred said?
I want everyone to look at us. I want everyone to say, look, there's Oscar Wilde with his board.
So, what should we let people see us eating?
Foie gras and lobster. And champagne.
For two. We do everything together.
Very good, Mr. Wilde.
I think Bosie did control Oscar, really. I mean, it's certainly true that when Oscar and Bosie were together, Oscar couldn't write. All his plays, which he wrote while with Bosie, were done when Bosie was away. He was either sent off to Egypt by his parents, or he'd had a row with Oscar, and Oscar used the month or 3 weeks or whatever to do a huge amount of writing. When they were together, he would come round. If they hadn't spent the night together, he would come round in the morning and he would get lunch from Oscar, and it would always be the Perrier-Jouet champagne, and it would always be the right food at the right place, always the most expensive. Oscar would shower him with gifts, and Oscar put up with his sulks and his tantrums for an enormous length of time. And he knew that it was harming him as an artist. He knew that, but he indulged Bosie much as a father indulges a child, and much as lovers indulge their lovers everywhere.
Whenever I want to do anything, you say you can't afford it. But you give all those renters cigarette cases.
But I've lavished presents on you. Every penny I've earned from my play, I have spent on you.
Oh, I'm sure you've been counting. You're so mean and penny-pinching and middle class. All you can think about is your bank balance.
Bosie, for God's sake, this is intolerable.
No gentleman ever has the slightest idea what his bank balance is.
Bosie could attack him and could get under his skin, and that also was attractive. So there is a certain masochistic side in that. Bosie could seem to be, at times, a rather destructive truth-teller to Oscar. So there were many bases to the relationship. I think, actually, Oscar was the best parent that Bosie never had.
I think he wanted from Oscar a reliability, which he did not get in his own family. He was smothered with love, perhaps not altogether happily, by his mother. And his father was this lunatic who beat him and was tyrannical and didn't love him at all. And he and his brothers were all suffered very much from their background. And Oscar was, in fact, a very sort of solid, not only physically, but also emotionally, solid character for Bosie, I think.
I thought you might like something to celebrate your return.
Oscar.
When I saw them in the window, they begged me on their knees to make them yours.
When Oscar could charm the birds out of the trees, even when he met the Marquis of Queensberry, Bosie's father, who was a terrible bully and with as I say, absolutely lacking all restraint, he charmed him. And when Bosie talked to his father afterwards, I mean, they sat, Marquis of Queensberry and Oscar Wilde sat in the Café Royal for 4 hours in delighted conversation.